I never dreamed I'd witness the day my grandmother would end up at the center of a headline-worthy scandal. Certainly not one involving our own homeowners association. Yet, that's exactly what happened on the third Tuesday of last month. It all began around 8 in the morning, a strangely bright and breezy day for our corner of the country, when I heard my grandmother's familiar tap-tap-tap of her cane on the front porch. She was determined to head to the pharmacy before the lunch rush, insisting she didn't need anyone's help. Even at 82, she prided herself on self-sufficiency and fiercely protected her independence. I was in the middle of making coffee when I noticed her from the kitchen window, slowly maneuvering into the driver's seat of her sedan. She'd owned that car since 1995, a boxy relic with a squeaky trunk and a radio that rarely picked up anything besides static. But oh, how she loved it. The thought of her on the road alone made me uneasy. She wasn't a bad driver by any stretch, but her reflexes weren't what they used to be. Still, I hesitated to stop her. She was easily offended if you even hinted she might need assistance. So, I told myself I'd keep an eye out, maybe follow her at a distance if necessary. That's when the phone rang. I set the coffee mug down and hurried over. It was my neighbor, Lucy, who lived 3 houses down. She was breathless, almost panicked. "Something's going on outside," she gasped. "I think the HOA is towing somebody's car." My mind didn't immediately leap to Grandma, because she was just about to pull out of the driveway, but a strange knot formed in my stomach. I quickly hopped off the call and rushed out the door. The spectacle I found was unreal. The old sedan was already hooked up to a tow truck, its front wheels lifted off the pavement. Standing beside, it was Donald Hastings, our HOA president for the past decade, looking as stiff as a coat rack in a perfectly pressed shirt. He had a cell phone to his ear, and he wore an expression that could make milk curdle. 2 other HOA board members flanked him, arms folded, nodding in agreement, as if they were planning some grand neighborhood purification project. I expected to see Grandma out on the curb, shaking her cane and yelling at them in that old southern drawl she sometimes used when she was angry. But she wasn't anywhere in sight. It took me an alarming few seconds to realize that she was still in the car. She sat behind the steering wheel, seatbelt on, eyes wide in disbelief. I froze, mind spinning. Why on earth were they towing her car while she was still inside? My immediate reaction was to wave my arms and scream at the tow truck driver to stop. He either didn't see me or chose to ignore me. There was an ugly squeal of metal on asphalt as the truck began to move forward, dragging Grandma's sedan with it. Panicked, I sprinted across the lawn, practically tripping over the daisies Grandma had planted last spring. I shouted at the top of my lungs, "Stop! There's someone in the car!" Donald Hastings swiveled his head toward me, face flushed with annoyance. "This car has multiple unpaid HOA violations," he snapped, as if that somehow justified hauling off an elderly woman. "We posted warnings. It's not my fault she refused to comply." I didn't have time to process the bureaucratic nonsense he was spouting. I reached the side of the tow truck, pounding on the driver's window, but the rig kept on rolling. Meanwhile, Grandma, flabbergasted, was fumbling with her seatbelt, trying to unhook it. She later told me that in the heat of the moment, her arthritic fingers simply wouldn't cooperate. The entire block seemed to be gathering now. I spotted Lucy across the street, phone in hand, presumably filming the bizarre event. Another neighbor, Jerry, who rarely spoke to anyone, appeared on his porch with his mouth hanging open. The expressions on everyone's faces ranged from astonishment to outrage. Yet no one seemed to know what to do to actually stop this unfolding nightmare. Before I could try to scramble onto the back of the tow truck, an impulsive idea at best, it sped up. Within seconds, it was disappearing around the corner. Donald Hastings and his cohorts scurried into a sleek SUV and followed. My heart pounded like a drum. I felt helpless, furious, and terrified all at once. Grandma had just been taken in her own car by the same people who were supposed to keep our neighborhood safe and orderly. I wish I could say I handled it calmly and rationally. Instead, I stood there in the middle of the road, dust swirling around me, stunned by the impossibility of it all. That was my grandma, my mother's mother, the woman who raised me when my folks passed away, and these power-tripping neighbors of mine had just whisked her away like an unwanted, illegally parked vehicle. It didn't register at first that what just happened might be more than a reckless towing job. I might have chalked it up to some bizarre misunderstanding, if not for the fact that my neighbor Lucy, filming the whole ordeal, came running up with tears in her eyes. This is kidnapping, isn't it?" she asked, voice trembling. Those words lodged themselves in my brain. Kidnapping. It sounded dramatic, but when I replayed the scene in my mind, an elderly woman inside her vehicle, forcibly removed from her home by the HOA's contracted tow company, it wasn't so far-fetched. And as we'd soon learn, neither did the local police think so. The moment I realized my grandma was effectively a captive, I dialed 911. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped my phone. While it rang, I tried to focus on the immediate problem. Where were they taking her? Did the tow truck driver even know someone was in the car? Or was he just ignoring it? Did Hastings and the HOA cronies expect to keep her at the impound lot? My mind spun with questions as the dispatcher finally answered. I struggled to steady my voice. "There's been a towing incident," I said, choosing my words carefully, even though my heart pounded with outrage. "My grandmother was in her car when it got towed by the HOA, against her will. They just drove off with her." At first, the dispatcher sounded puzzled, as if I were speaking in riddles. After a few clarifying questions, she promised to send an officer immediately. "Stay where you are," she instructed. "We'll come to you." Putting down the phone, I felt the weight of the neighborhood's silent stares. Lucy was still by my side, hugging herself nervously. Jerry lingered across the street, phone in hand, as if waiting to see if this was some bizarre movie shoot. More neighbors began trickling out of their homes. Curiosity piqued. Usually, our block was filled with the hum of lawnmowers and the chatter of retirees discussing local gossip. Now it was quiet, tense, and unsettling. Within minutes, though it felt like hours, a patrol car rounded the corner. 2 officers, one male, one female, stepped out. I approached them, breath catching in my throat, and tried to explain the insane story as calmly as I could manage. They exchanged a look that suggested they'd never encountered a situation quite like this before. The male officer, Officer Randall, asked me to repeat the details. "They towed the car, with your grandmother still inside?" "Yes," I said, hearing how absurd it sounded out loud. "And she's 82. She has some mobility issues, but she was definitely conscious and alert. She was trying to get out when they sped away." The female officer, Sergeant Bilson, radioed something back to their dispatch. She asked if I had a description of the vehicle. I gave her every detail I could recall. The tow truck's color, the company name stenciled on the side, the direction they headed. Lucy chimed in with what she'd captured on her phone, showing them the video she'd recorded. The officers watched, faces growing darker by the second. "That does look like unauthorized removal of a person," Bilson murmured, glancing at Randall. He nodded grimly. They requested a backup unit, and another squad car arrived soon after, lights flashing. Within a quarter of an hour, there were 3 police vehicles parked along the street, and the normally placid suburban air felt charged with tension. A few neighbors were openly filming now, cell phones raised, capturing each moment for posterity or perhaps local news. Meanwhile, in my mind, time was moving agonizingly slowly. All I could think about was Grandma, her confusion, her fear. I imagined her pounding on the window of that sedan, calling out for help. If there was ever a reason to lose my cool, this was it. The next step was to find out where the HOA had taken her. The biggest immediate lead was the tow truck company's name, Scenic Vista Recovery Services. The male officer used his onboard computer to track down an address for their lot. It was located just outside the city limits, about a 20-minute drive away. With my permission, the police officers said they would go straight there. I insisted on following them. They hesitated at first, but after seeing my desperation, they relented. "Stay in your car," they told me. "And please keep a safe distance." Lucy offered to drive with me, an offer I gladly accepted because my hands were still shaking too badly to grip the wheel. By the time we pulled onto the main road, the 2 squad cars had already raced ahead, lights flashing. I tried to calm my nerves by focusing on Lucy's chatter about how she once had a run-in with the HOA over a trash bin violation. It didn't help much, but at least it took my mind off the worst of my fears. On the way, we passed meticulously landscaped lawns and tidy houses that looked straight out of a suburban brochure. It struck me how a place that seemed so wholesome, so safe, could harbor such a wildly overbearing HOA. Typically, folks think of HOAs as a nuisance, sending letters about mailbox colors or lawn lengths. But that morning, it felt like the neighborhood association had turned into a vigilante force, willing to do anything to maintain a twisted version of order. When we reached the impound lot, the sight was grim. Chain-link fences topped with barbed wire, a large metal gate guarded by a single, bored-looking attendant. The police cars were already inside, talking to a different employee, a wiry young man in a stained uniform. Lucy and I parked outside and hurried up to the gate. We recognized the tow truck, parked near a long row of vehicles, some battered and rusted, others brand new. My grandmother's sedan was nowhere in sight. Frantic, I approached the attendant. "Where's the blue sedan you just towed?" I demanded, voice shaking with urgency. He looked up, blinking. "We haven't dropped off a sedan yet," he said, sounding genuinely confused. It felt like a punch to the gut. If the truck was here, where was Grandma's car? The wiry employee motioned for us to wait. He disappeared into a small, windowless office for a moment, then came back out, scratching his head. "We had a call for a pickup in a neighborhood, but looks like the driver hasn't officially checked in. The paperwork's incomplete." Officer Randall reemerged from behind the fence. His expression was grim. He claims the truck arrived without a vehicle. Says the driver unhooked it somewhere else. My heart dropped. The female officer joined us. "We got a possible direction," she said, gesturing to a set of fresh tire tracks in the dirt. "We'll keep searching." Somewhere in some unknown location, they had unhooked the sedan with Grandma inside. My stomach churned as I realized the unthinkable. The HOA might not just have towed her car to a lot. They might have hidden her. Lucy placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "We'll find her," she said, voice tight. I nodded, desperately hoping she was right. Time was slipping away, and every second was an eternity. Standing there in the dusty lot, hearing the hum of distant traffic on the highway, I promised myself I wouldn't rest until Grandma was safe. And as the police regrouped and prepared to widen their search, I had a sinking feeling that our quiet suburban life had just shattered into something far darker and more complicated than I ever imagined possible. We ended up forming a makeshift convoy with the police cars in the lead and me and Lucy trailing close behind. My nerves were frayed, but if there was one small mercy, it was that the officers seemed to take the situation seriously. They called in additional units to help search the area. When a kidnapping call goes out on police channels, even if it stems from something as bizarre as an HOA dispute, everyone listens. Not long after we left the impound lot, Lucy's phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen. "It's a text from my husband, Todd," she said, eyes wide. "He says that the HOA board is gathered at the community clubhouse. Something about an emergency meeting." I narrowed my eyes, adrenaline surging. If the board members were at the clubhouse, then maybe Grandma's car was there too. It was a ridiculous notion. Why would they bring her to the clubhouse of all places? But it was the only lead we had. I relayed the information to Sergeant Bilson, and she nodded. "We'll head there." The drive over was surreal. The wide suburban streets that once felt so safe now seemed ominous. Every parked car a potential hideout. My reflection stared back at me from the side mirror, face drawn and tense. In the back seat, Lucy was on her phone, presumably updating Todd. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. When we reached the clubhouse, a low beige brick structure with a perfectly manicured lawn, we saw multiple cars parked out front, including Donald Hastings's SUV. My pulse spiked. Several uniformed officers spilled out of their cruisers and approached the entrance. I followed cautiously, worried about what I might find inside. Despite the bright, warm sunshine, the clubhouse interior felt cold. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, reflecting off the polished linoleum floors. There in the main hall, I spotted Donald Hastings standing behind a folding table adorned with coffee urns and stale-looking donuts. Surrounding him were the other HOA board members, looking tense, and, shockingly, my grandmother's sedan keys sat on the table next to a stack of paperwork. But Grandma herself was nowhere in sight. The second I saw those familiar keys, a wave of desperation crashed over me. "Where is she?" I demanded, voice echoing in the otherwise silent space. Hastings merely pursed his lips. "You have no right to barge in here," he snapped, addressing the police as though they were unwelcome visitors. Sergeant Bilson stepped forward. "Sir, we have a report that you and your associates towed a vehicle with an elderly woman still inside it. We need you to tell us where she is." Hastings lifted his chin in that imperious way I'd come to associate with petty authority. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said, even as his eyes darted nervously to the table. "We followed all procedures. The car was illegally parked. We have the right to enforce neighborhood guidelines." A flurry of conversation erupted. The other board members exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, a woman named Barbara, who had always seemed more level-headed, spoke up, arms trembling. "Donald, tell them the truth. We can't keep covering this up." Hastings tried to hush her, but she pressed on. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. We just wanted to issue a warning. But when we saw her in the car, it was too late." The tow truck operator said he had orders. I stepped closer, heart hammering. "Orders to do what?" I demanded. But before Barbara could answer, one of the officers stepped in, instructing Hastings that this was now a serious matter, and he needed to cooperate or face immediate arrest. Hastings's eyes blazed. For a moment, it looked like he might lash out, but then he deflated. "Fine," he hissed. We took her to the old maintenance shed behind Oakwood Lane. My stomach dropped. The old maintenance shed behind Oakwood Lane? That place had been abandoned for years. Rumor was it used to store lawn mowers and snowblowers. Why on earth would they take her there? Officer Randall pressed further. "Is she still there?" Hastings shrugged, unwilling to meet our eyes. Furious, Sergeant Bilson grabbed his arm, guiding him toward the door. "You're coming with us," she said. "We'll see if this information pans out." I spun on my heels, racing back outside, Lucy close behind. My mind whirled with images of Grandma locked inside some decrepit structure, afraid and alone. There was no time to waste. The police had enough probable cause to justify a forced entry, so we roared out of the parking lot in a full-blown caravan. The drive to Oakwood Lane took only 5 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. Houses gave way to a less developed area lined with tall, scraggly trees and an overgrown field. A crooked wooden sign reading, "Maintenance Personnel Only," pointed to a gravel path that wound through the brush. By the time we reached the end, we saw a weathered shed with a sagging roof. The tow truck from earlier sat parked nearby. Engine off, driver's side door open. My heart lurched. Had they stashed Grandma here? The thought was too awful, too strange to fully absorb. But as the officers parked and jumped out, weapons at the ready, I sprinted ahead, ignoring their calls to remain back. Gravel crunched beneath my shoes as I reached the shed. I could hear movement inside, scraping, a muffled voice. I yanked the door open. Dust billowed out, making me cough. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and there, in the glow of a single dangling bulb, was Grandma. She was slumped on an old wooden chair, but she was upright, awake. A moan of relief escaped my lips. "Grandma!" I rushed to her side, cradling her face. She peered up at me, eyes watery. They locked me in here," she murmured, voice trembling. "Said I was trespassing. I didn't know what was happening. An elderly woman shouldn't have to endure this." I blinked back tears, trying to stay strong for her. "It's okay," I managed. "We're here now." Behind me, the police swarmed the shed. They found the tow truck driver cowering in a corner, radio in hand, apparently waiting for instructions. Sergeant Bilson barked orders, and within seconds, he was in handcuffs. Hastings was dragged forward, forcibly confronted with the scene he'd orchestrated. The look on his face was pure panic, as though he never truly believed his cunning plan would end in real legal consequences. As I held Grandma's hand, helping her stand, I realized the severity of the situation. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was an actual crime. Several, in fact. You don't confine an elderly woman against her will and try to call it neighborhood enforcement. That's not how the world works. Not even in the twisted realm of overzealous HOAs. I guided Grandma out into the sunlight. Lucy threw an arm around her shoulders. Police lights flashed against the battered shed, illuminating the magnitude of what had taken place. The quiet suburban bubble we lived in had burst, replaced by a harsh new reality where people in power thought they could get away with anything. But maybe, just maybe, justice would prove them wrong. The police wasted no time formally placing Donald Hastings and the tow truck driver under arrest. Barbara and the other HOA board members were detained for questioning, though not all of them ended up in handcuffs. Some, it turned out, had protested Hastings' drastic measures from the start, but had been steamrolled by his overbearing leadership. Still, it was clear that complicity had run high. Ignoring a situation can be just as damning as orchestrating it, especially when it ends in a kidnapping. In the chaos, police radios crackling, neighbors arriving on scene, cameras clicking, Grandma was escorted to an ambulance for a thorough checkup. I stayed by her side, holding her hand while a sympathetic EMT named Andrea examined her. "She's a bit dehydrated," Andrea said gently, giving Grandma some water. "But otherwise, she seems okay. We should still take her to the hospital to be sure." I couldn't help noticing how subdued Grandma looked. Gone was her feisty independence. She clutched my arm the entire ride to the hospital, as though the moment she let go, some new horror would snatch her away again. I tried to reassure her, saying things like they can't hurt you anymore and they're all going to jail for what they did. But deep down, I knew those words didn't erase the trauma she'd been through. A small crowd had formed outside the hospital by the time we arrived. Curious onlookers and local reporters hoping for a sensational story. Lucy and Todd, along with a couple of our other neighbors, rushed to meet us in the ER waiting room. Hushed conversation filled the air as I explained what little I knew. The police had discovered that Hastings had a track record of towing vehicles he deemed problematic, even though none of those incidents had escalated to the level of forcibly confining someone. He had a personal stake in enforcing HOA fines, apparently collecting a percentage of the towing fees. Greed or power trip? Probably both from the looks of it. During Grandma's examination, the hospital staff kept me updated. Physically, she was mostly unharmed aside from bruises on her arms and the psychological strain of the ordeal. The staff wanted to keep her overnight for observation, so I stayed with her, dozing fitfully in a chair by her bed. I remember waking in the wee hours of the morning to hear her whisper, "I was so scared." My heart clenched. I reassured her she was safe now. But fear lingers, especially for an elderly woman who thought she knew the boundaries of her own neighborhood. By mid-morning, a detective from the local police department arrived to take Grandma's formal statement. She was calm, but occasionally paused, swallowing back tears as she recounted every detail. How she was about to leave for the pharmacy, how suddenly men were banging on her window, hooking her car to the tow truck, ignoring her cries to wait while she unbuckled her seatbelt. "Next thing I knew," she said, "I was being driven off. I yelled at them to let me out, but they said they had board approval to remove all trespassers." She grimaced at the memory. The detective, a soft-spoken woman named Hughes, listened intently, taking notes. Her expression was a mix of outrage and pity. "Thank you, ma'am," she said when Grandma finished. "I promise we'll do everything we can to pursue justice." Outside Grandma's hospital room, Detective Hughes briefly explained to me that both Hastings and the tow truck driver were being charged with kidnapping, among other things. The rest of the HOA board members might face charges of conspiracy or accessory, depending on what the investigation revealed. It was a lot to process. I'd never once considered that a group of suburbanites in charge of mailbox standards and yard heights could be capable of something this monstrous. The day passed in a blur of phone calls, from insurance companies, from extended family who'd heard the news, from the local media wanting a statement. Lucy did her best to run interference, gently turning down interview requests. Grandma needed rest, not a horde of microphones in her face. The doctors confirmed she was stable enough to go home that evening, provided she had someone to stay with her. Obviously, I wasn't about to let her out of my sight. When I pulled the car up to the hospital entrance, she looked around anxiously. They didn't take my car again, did they? She asked, only half joking. My heart broke. Her beloved sedan was still out there somewhere, presumably retrieved by the police as evidence. I tried to comfort her, saying I'd help replace it if needed, but she just gave a sad smile. That car was part of my independence, she said softly. On the ride home, we passed the neighborhood clubhouse. It was closed off with yellow police tape. A few anxious residents milled about, their faces heavy with shock and confusion. None of us ever thought the place designated for ice cream socials and holiday parties could become a crime scene. But there it was. Even the well-kept gardens out front seemed grim, as though they too were mourning the abrupt end of any illusion of neighborly civility. I parked in our driveway and helped Grandma inside. I sat her on the couch, propping her feet up on a cushion. Then I made a pot of tea the way she liked it, strong and sweet, with a dash of lemon. For a long while, we said nothing. She sipped her tea, and I perched on the ottoman, watching her face as she processed a world that suddenly felt so different than it did just yesterday. Finally, she spoke. I always knew that man was trouble, ever since he sent me that letter about the pansies being too pink. Her lips twisted into a small, ironic smile, but there was real pain behind it. I just never dreamed he'd have the nerve to do something like this. I placed my hand on hers. Neither did I, Grandma. Neither did any of us. The enormity of it settled between us, an unspoken agreement that sometimes the very people entrusted with small, local powers can wield them in horrifying ways. But overshadowing my anger was a flood of relief that she was safe, right here, sipping tea and complaining about the bitterness of hospital coffee. Things could have ended much worse. That night, as she dozed on the couch and I clicked off the lamp, I felt a strange mix of gratitude and unease. Gratitude that we found her in time. Gratitude that the police were on our side. Gratitude for neighbors like Lucy who didn't hesitate to stand up for what was right. But uneasy, knowing that our quiet suburban neighborhood was forever changed, and that the real battle, seeking justice in court, dealing with the aftermath, was just beginning. Over the next weeks, the story of my grandmother's kidnapping by the HOA exploded across local news, then national outlets, much to everyone's disbelief. HOA gone wild, screamed one headline. Towed TO terror, read another. The whole situation felt both surreal and embarrassingly public. Every time I answered the phone, I wondered if it was another reporter fishing for details. Most of our neighbors were horrified, disowning the actions of Donald Hastings and those who had supported him. Barbara and a handful of others issued public apologies, claiming they'd never authorized locking anyone in the maintenance shed. Whether that was true or an attempt to save face, we'd soon find out in court. Grandma, meanwhile, was adapting to her newfound status as an unlikely local celebrity. The hospital staff had prescribed therapy sessions to help her process the trauma, and though she was hesitant at first, she eventually agreed. I guess I can use all the help I can get, she admitted, her voice uncharacteristically shaky. I still jump whenever I hear a truck engine. Her usual spunk returned slowly. One morning, I caught her swatting at a local cameraman who got too close for a snapshot as she walked out to get the mail. I'm not a zoo animal, she barked. I couldn't help but grin. It was my feisty grandma, back in action. Then came the day of the preliminary hearing. The courthouse was overflowing with onlookers and press. Lucy insisted on accompanying us for support. She'd even organized a small group of neighbors who carried signs reading "Justice for Ethel" and "Neighbors not hostages." Grandma turned red as a beet when she saw that. "Good Lord, girl, I'm not marching in a parade," she muttered, but I could see she was touched. Donald Hastings and the tow truck driver, whose name was revealed to be Mark Gaines, appeared before the judge in orange jumpsuits, faces drawn. Hastings looked especially disheveled, a far cry from the crisp, commanding figure who once policed our street for tiny infractions. I didn't feel pity. I only felt anger. When the prosecutor read the charges, kidnapping, false imprisonment, conspiracy, Hastings' attorney argued that it was all a misunderstanding, that Grandma's presence in the car was unfortunate timing, and that the shed incident was an impromptu error in judgment. But the judge seemed unimpressed. Outside the courtroom, Barbara approached Grandma. With tears in her eyes, she said, "I'm so sorry." I tried to reason with him. Grandma nodded politely, lips set in a hard line. "If you'd really tried, dear, I wouldn't have ended up in a shed," she replied coolly. Barbara's face fell. I felt a pang of sympathy. It was possible she truly had been railroaded by Hastings, but at the end of the day, her inaction spoke volumes. As the legal process churned on, the HOA's entire board resigned in disgrace. The neighborhood needed new leadership, and a swift reorganization was put in motion. Lucy was asked by several neighbors to run for the new president's position. She was hesitant. Who would want that responsibility after the fiasco? But after some convincing, she agreed. "I'll do it as long as we focus on community building, not code enforcement mania," she declared. Everyone applauded. In the midst of the chaos, an unexpected development lifted Grandma's spirits. A local car dealership owner, seeing her plight on the news, offered to replace her beloved sedan for free. "It's not going to be the same model," he said apologetically, "but we'd be honored if you'd accept a newer, safer vehicle." At first, Grandma bristled. She hated handouts, but eventually, she warmed to the idea. "It's not about the car," she murmured to me. "It's about people showing they care." And so she accepted the gift, a small victory overshadowed by the looming trial. Weeks turned into months. Pre-trial motions were filed, depositions taken. I helped Grandma navigate the labyrinth of legal proceedings, making sure she understood each step. The prosecution was adamant. They wanted Hastings and Gaines held fully accountable. Meanwhile, several of the HOA board members negotiated plea deals, providing evidence of Hastings' manipulative tactics. It turned out he'd been systematically inflating fees, scheduling tows, and pocketing a nice profit on the side. When people complained, he threatened them with more fines or property liens. It was a twisted little fiefdom that had finally crumbled. When the trial began in earnest, Grandma took the stand. I was there in the front row, Lucy beside me, my stomach churning with nerves. Grandma, in a modest floral dress, appeared smaller than I'd ever seen her. Yet her voice was steady as she recounted the harrowing events. The jury leaned in, eyes glued to this soft-spoken senior as she described being dragged away in her own car, locked in a ramshackle shed, and left alone for hours, confused and frightened. The defense tried to undermine her, claiming she had memory issues or had consented to ride with them to sort things out. Grandma's eyes flashed. "Consent?" she exclaimed. "I was hollering for them to stop. I asked to be let out. How is that consenting?" She shot them the kind of look only an experienced grandmother can give, a look that speaks to decades of no-nonsense living. The defense attorney wisely backed off. In the end, the jury deliberated for less than a day. They found Hastings and Gaines guilty on all major counts. The judge, citing the egregious nature of the crime, targeting a vulnerable senior, handed down stiff sentences. Hastings was visibly shaken, while Gaines just stared at the floor. It was a relief, a vindication. Still, as Grandma and I left the courthouse, passing the rows of cameras and microphones, I felt a bittersweet twinge. No matter the outcome, we couldn't rewind time and remove the trauma she'd endured. Justice was served, but the scars lingered. In the following weeks, life in our neighborhood began to stabilize. Lucy was officially elected HOA president with a slate of new board members who promised more transparency and compassion. One of their first acts was to repeal the stringent bylaws that had caused so many conflicts. Instead of punishing residents for minor infractions, they implemented a neighborhood volunteer system to help people maintain their properties, an especially big help to seniors like Grandma, who sometimes just needed a little assistance. Neighbors who once only waved in passing began chatting with each other about their gardens, their kids, their day-to-day routines. In an odd way, the ordeal had reminded everyone that community isn't about policing each other. It's about supporting each other. A few folks even pitched in to repaint the clubhouse, turning it from a site of fear and wrongdoing into a place for social gatherings and potlucks again. Grandma wasn't ready to set foot in it yet, though. She said she'd get there in her own time. As for Grandma herself, she gradually recovered her spark. The new sedan, which she dubbed Bluebird, gave her a sense of independence once more. She eventually went on her own to that pharmacy run, though not without me trailing at a respectful distance, just to be sure. She made me promise not to fuss over her too much, but we both knew I couldn't help it. After coming so close to losing her, I found every moment with her more precious than before. Sometimes, I still catch her gazing out the window at the street, a troubled look on her face. I know she's reliving that day, remembering the feeling of helplessness. But then she'll sigh, pat my hand, and say, "I'm glad we're still here, sugar. I'm glad we have each other." And I realize she's right. We survived a nightmare, but we came through stronger, more aware of the fragility of trust and the value of true community. In the end, the scandal might fade from the headlines, replaced by the next big story of the week. But in our little cul-de-sac, it left a profound mark. Whenever I look at the old patches of tire marks on the street, faded now by rain and sun, I'm reminded of how quickly life can shift from normal to horrifying in just an instant. And I'm reminded, too, that sometimes justice does prevail, even if it arrives in the most unexpected way. With a police squad car, handcuffs, and the unwavering courage of an 82-year-old grandmother who refused to be written off as just another car to tow. Grandma might still grumble about her new car's fancy features, and she might refuse to set foot near the old maintenance shed. But every now and then, she gets a gleam in her eye when she passes by the reformed HOA board. It's a look of triumph, of survival. "They messed with the wrong grandma," she likes to say, half joking. I can't help but agree. They sure did. End of story.